I'll be honest with you, Andrew. I think a lot of people overthink Boston a little bit. I think they get really worked up and worried about all the things, and people don't necessarily do that so much about CIM.
Like, what is the ceiling? Does it vary? Like, how fast do you think that I can get?
It's very difficult for me to pinpoint exactly where you will get to, but I hope to think it would be somewhere in the vicinity of 112 to 113. I don't think that's impossible, let me put it that way. I've really learned in the last few years, experimenting with myself and looking at people like Connor Mance, Clayton Young, and some other athletes that I follow, that if you can get someone into a really good place with their mile, 3K fitness, 5K fitness, then they're in a pretty good position to start a marathon specific block. And then we just start basically extending the long runs, adding a little bit more threshold to the long runs, both LT1 and LT2. One of the great discussions that you've already pretty much adhered to here is how long should that phase be? The common consensus is 10, 12, I even sometimes see 14 or 16 weeks. But I started noticing a few years ago, I've seen a lot of people gain a lot of success from doing those blocks a bit shorter than 10, 12 weeks, more like 6 to 8.
So I had a nice little talk with my coach, Matt Fox. I'm going to call this a coach's corner. We talked all things training specifically for the Boston Marathon. It's a nice little chat. Or in Australia, as they like to call it, a chat. Subscribe, do all those things. Yeah. Hope you enjoy.
He was an 800-meter runner. Now he's running 800 marathons in a row every month till the end of time. Please welcome my coach, Matt Fox. How you doing?
I'm good, Mr. Pozza, midlife runner. I really appreciate you having me on once again. And I thought for a second, if I run 800 marathons in a row, how many years will that be? I'll have to work that out afterwards, but that'd be a fun experiment.
Yeah, you'll be my age by the time that ends. All right. I like the rapid fire series that you're doing. So I like just no small talk. You just, straight to business, no foreplay, just bangers. We're just going right to it. So similarly, I want to get right into it. The Boston Marathon's coming up. We're training for the Boston Marathon, and a lot of people it's top of mind. So I wanted to center this conversation around the Boston Marathon. So the first question is, as a coach, how do you prepare your runner for the Boston Marathon, specifically that race?
So I think in the bigger picture, the answer is it depends a little bit on the athlete. Now we both know that, and I could speak about that for half an hour, but I'll steer clear of that one. Let's be a bit more general. Boston, everyone knows, is very hilly, very specifically in the last half or last third of the race. So I wouldn't necessarily be changing too much in a sense of doing anything too different to preparing for another marathon, other than incorporating quite a lot of incline and uphill and downhill within training runs. And more specifically, I see that as being, I mean, probably most importantly within the long runs, not all of them, but probably at least half of them. We should be aiming to do very similar elevation gain and loss than the Boston Marathon course has within a long run. And then also, I think it's a good idea to, within some of the midweek workouts. So, you've been with me for quite some time now. We typically do a midweek interval session that's focusing on VO2 max and slash or threshold. Not all of those need to include hills, but I think maybe at least one every three. So that would be within the block, probably three workouts. We'll do some uphill and downhill as well. So one good example might be instead of doing 10 by 1K with a minute rest on the track or on the road, we would do it on the road, but maybe do the first, third, fifth, seventh, and ninth reps going up 4 or 5%, and then the other ones, the even ones going down. That's just an example of what you could do. So yeah, other than that, I would keep it pretty much the same as marathon training for a flat race, but incorporating some hills into the long runs and to the interval sessions as well.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, I refer to those workouts midweek as the Wednesday Whopper. So Wednesday Whopper, but not at the track on some elevation. Secondly, you ran the Boston Marathon last year. You paced Floberg to the first 23 miles of that race. Do you have any advice for like pacing strategy or course tips for anyone about to run Boston?
I wouldn't say I'm the best person to give course tips because I haven't done the race more than once, and there's lots of people out there that have done it many times. I think Peter Bronker's a really good resource for people that want to learn, the real ins and outs of the course. He's done it a lot of times and spoken to many people. But, my 2 cents are I wouldn't overthink this and get too worried about the hills. They are there, they're in the back half of the race. It's really critical, stating the obvious perhaps, to not be at the start of that point of the race already in trouble. That's a recipe for disaster. So with that said, you need to make sure that you're pacing yourself a little bit more conservatively than a normal marathon that's on the flat, because you essentially want to hit the 15, 16, 17 mile point at Boston 1, 2, 3% fresher than you would on a flat course, because in a flat course like Berlin or Valencia or many of the fast ones, Chicago, I mean, I'm recording this looking at the course of one of the fastest courses in the world right now out the window. If you hit the 18-mile mark and you feel 90%, you'll get to the end probably okay. Okay. But Boston, with those hills in the way, you need to get there, not quite at 90%, maybe 85%. So it's important to take it a little bit more conservatively. Luckily, that first 15, 16 miles is more downhill than flat or even uphill. So you can almost make use of that and chill a little bit down those hills. Other than that, I'll be honest with you, Andrew, I think a lot of people overthink Boston a little bit. I think they get really worked up and worried about all the things, and people don't necessarily do that so much about CIM. And I've run both, and I think they're kind of similar. I think CIM's a little bit faster for sure. It's a bit more net downhill, and the hills are more in the first half. But I don't see too many people overthinking or really overanalyzing CIM. But Boston, I do. And I think sometimes in many cases, if you overanalyze things and you worry about them a lot, they start to become harder than what they really are. And so I think, relax. Yeah, there's some hills in the second half for sure. So let's get to those hills a little bit easier than normal. But otherwise, don't worry about it. You'll be all good.
Yeah, it's I ran Marine Corps Marathon last year in October, and it's the opposite where the first 5K and then the front 10K is where all the hills are. And I remember climbing them in the first 5K like I wasn't 100%, but I was like, this is it. Like this is what I was, worried about. It's like we've got bigger hills in Texas and this isn't that big of a deal. So anyway, that's good to know. All right, so now I want to switch to the concept of peaking. That's the next subject for that race, which I just mentioned Marine Corps. I felt like I probably got overcooked, peaked too early. And it's been a really good thread in the Discord server for the Sweat Elite Coaching Academy on peaking. So I want to know, like, when you're coaching an athlete and you're looking down, what do you look for to know when your athletes are peaking? And how do you adjust the plan if you feel like maybe they are peaking too early?
It's a bit of a tricky thing, really. And I think if you throw the eggs or tomatoes at the wall and just sort of hope for the best, you'll normally get relatively close. But if you really want to make sure that people are peaking well, it's pretty important to understand, in my eyes, a couple of things. One, their last 3 months, where their training load has been, where their bigger workouts have been, but even more so, their last 1 to 3 years as well, where they've been peaking, what's worked for them, what volume they've done, etc. And then also, as you well know, because we've had lots of discussions about this, the bigger picture in terms of their overall volume, how long that is. But speaking in the context of peaking for someone that might be, a marathoner that took up running in, say, 2020 or 2021, I think typically people like that can peak 2 to 3, maybe even 4 times a year in a marathon. And I think that after every single peak, and this is quite a different case for someone like myself that's been running for almost 20 years. But speaking to the first example, I think once a peak occurs, it's ideal for there to be a short rest period. I think that rest period doesn't necessarily need to be completely off running, but I do think that for at least 10 days, you could argue maybe even 14 days, there's just nothing hard in there. I think jogging's okay, walking's great, cycling's great, but I almost think people don't realize the mental side is worth really looking at as well. And when you're giving athletes really hard workouts 2, 3 times a week, there's sort of a cognitive load that comes with that as well, that when you have a rest period, that can relax and fade away and reduce stress and load as well. I think almost physical load can be altered a little bit by the mental load as well in having to work hard or work easy. So after that 10, 14 days of downtime, I then think it's important to put in a little bit of time where, and we've been doing this for the last few months, is to really make sure the athlete is in a good place with their VO2 max and threshold. But I've really learned in the last few years, experimenting with myself, even experimenting with, to some extent, with your training, other athletes training, and looking at people like Connor Mance, Clayton Young, and some other athletes that I follow, that if you can get someone into a really good place with their mile 3K fitness, 5K fitness, I used to think of it more like 5K, 10K, and that's not wrong, but I actually think mile 3K fitness, so that really high intensity VO2 max work, if you can get someone into a good position with that, which typically will take, well, it depends on the athlete and how long they've been running, but somewhere between, say, 8 and 12 weeks, then they're in a pretty good position to start a marathon specific block. And then we just start basically extending the long runs, adding a little bit more threshold to the long runs, both LT1 and LT2. And, one of the great discussions that you've already pretty much adhered to here is how long should that phase be? And for a very long time, I thought, and this was mostly based on looking at things like Runner's World, looking at influencers and all these things, the common consensus is 10, 12, I even sometimes see 14 or 16 weeks. But I started noticing a few years ago, maybe even closer to 3 years ago, 3.5, that a lot of people were achieving great success by shortening those specific marathon blocks. So, referring to the time that I said where you're extending that long run out and adding a lot more threshold. I've seen a lot of people gain a lot of success from doing those blocks a bit shorter than 10, 12 weeks, more like 6 to 8. And that really drove home when I interviewed Andy Buchanan, the Australian national record holder now in the marathon, when he shared that his specific marathon block or the time at which he extended those marathon workouts was only 6 weeks long. And not only was it 6 weeks long, in the middle of that block, he actually had to take a few days off with 3 weeks to go with an Achilles problem. So not only was the block very short, he also had to have half a week off. So you could argue he only really did 5.5 weeks of marathon specific work and still ran, not only did he run 2:06:22, he did interviews after that saying that he thinks he can run faster, indicating he could probably run 2:05, which is crazy to think about. So going back to your question, how do you peak? I think I view that in that lens. It's like that recovery period, that building back up to try and get into a good place with really 3K, I think is probably the best just single event to get really good at. And if you're good at 3K, you're going to be good at mile and 5K anyway, because the fitness is very similar. And then you can use that as a block to really start your specific marathon phase. And the durations of all those things are a bit different depending on the athlete and how long they've been running for. But that's the sort of the overarching way I look at how to peak for a marathon.
Reminds me, Steve Magnus said something to the effect of the mile training and marathon training is 80% the same for elite and sub-elite runners. And of course, then as you get to the race specific work, this, marathon block, yes, the long runs get longer, the workouts get more in alignment with the marathon. So that starts to make a lot of sense. So I know I put in the Discord, I was like, Coach, sign me up for 6 weeks. I meant plus 2 weeks of taper. So that's like 8 weeks. 8 weeks is good. So that is something we'll be doing towards Boston. All right. And then, so another thing I wanted to talk about, muscle tension. It's funny how in running, you just go like topic to topic. Steve Magnus was talking about muscle tension, and I feel like that's what I was missing. So what things are we doing to maintain muscle tension? What types of runs and what things are we doing around to keep that pep in the step?
Another thing, it's wild to think I've been in this game for 18 and a half years and I learned something extremely valuable in the last slightly more than 12 months, maybe 14 months. And that is exactly this topic. And I think strides are one thing that I often looked at and thought not very important, maybe important just to add in just before the race, and how wrong I was. I think this specifically talks to that. I think adding in strides at the end of an easy run or even a long run at least once a week, probably even twice, or you could argue 3 times a week for some. There definitely comes a risk when it comes to strides because if you run them too fast, we all know that probably the easiest way to get injured is by sprinting very fast. There's a risk of getting injured doing anything. I know people that have pulled their calf jogging, 9-minute mile pace, but I think the highest risk is sprinting. We don't want to necessarily be sprinting on those strides. We want to be running around 90% of top speed, which basically just means probably 400 or 800 meter pace. So roughly the pace you could hold for 2 or 3 minutes, or a minute and a half to 2.5 minutes, something like that. So I think adding in once or twice a week after an easy run, but then also these hill sprints that we've been doing for a while now, and I've been doing all year, and you've been doing for the most part over the last few months. I think this is another good way to really improve that aspect as well. And that's at least once a fortnight. So, sorry, that's an Australian term. Every 2 weeks. I sometimes forget fortnight's not said in the US. Every 2 weeks, these hill sprints where we're doing 10 seconds, 15 seconds, or 20-second hill sprints. I think that there's a place for all three of those. I tend to lean more into the 10 and the 20, but 15 is also good because 10-second sprints, you can get to basically 100% speed. Whereas if you're doing 20-second sprints, it's very hard to get 100% speed out of those. You can get about 95, 98, but you can't really hold 10 reps of 20 seconds at 100% speed on a hill sprint. But I do think that the anaerobic power, which transitions over to pretty good aerobic power from those 20-second hill sprints, is really relevant too. And so every 2 weeks, every 14 days, we should be adding in a session of 10 times either 10 seconds or 20-second hill sprints with an easy walk back recovery. This is a hard workout, but it's hard in a very different way. If you're used to grinding 20-mile long runs or 10 by a K or these sorts of things, it will be hard, but it will be very different hard. It's sort of hard for 5, 10 seconds, like very hard, and then recover. And the other nice thing about it is the recovery doesn't actually matter, and it's almost better to be longer than shorter. And so on these hill sprints, it's good just to slowly walk back, go again when you're ready. But there's none of this 50 seconds, 51 seconds, 52 seconds looking at the watch, getting ready to go again. You don't need to do that with the hill sprints or even the strides for that matter. Go when you're ready to go. You don't want to have more than 5 minutes, otherwise your muscles might start cooling a bit. I'd love to hear your opinion on whether you think that this has improved your ability to feel good going into races. Because that half marathon you ran, I was really happy about because we weren't necessarily training for the half marathon, but you ran a huge PB. So I'm keen to hear what you think about the answer I just gave.
Yeah, it's relevant because I ran a 1:20:35, which was a 3.5 minute, roughly 3.5 minute PR at the Austin International Half Marathon, which is 300 feet elevation loss, but there's still some gain after 9 miles. All of a sudden you turn and there's some hills. And I remember talking to Floberg after the race, and I know he struggled on that hill, and then listening to a couple recaps, it took him by surprise. I floated up those hills. I was, as Jake Barraclough says, I was taking scalps, as I would just
Mm.
like pass people. And I got to the top and I just rolled over them and I kept going. And I remember just thinking like, this is the hill work taking, effect right now because yeah, I mean, my heart rate was a little bit elevated, but like climbing it from a physical standpoint wasn't that big of a deal. And I will say a second thing on this is that I have a garage in my a gym in my garage. And I do compound lifts, I do squats, I switched to quarter squats because that's trending. I do deadlifts, RDLs, I do calf raises, straight legged and with bent knee. I do reverse lunges, I do all of these things, but then I go do hill work. And if I haven't done it in a while, I'll be sore. And I'm like, how am I
Mm.
sore? I literally train all of these muscles all the time, but it's a different ball game. It's a different beast. So I'm a huge fan of the hill works. And I feel like when I've shown up flat before on marathons before coaching, that it had to do with a loss of muscle tension. I thought I lost too much fitness. I think I probably still had the fitness. I just didn't have that muscle tension.
It's really fascinating, like if you look at it running at face value, it seems simple, and in some regards it is. But then when you start to really dig into these little things, fueling, weight, muscle tension, carbs, protein. Like it's a really interesting mathematical almost equation. And I'm loving this last, and it's almost like you're joining me on this journey with slightly different experiments, but I'm really enjoying experimenting. And to be honest, I'm actually very more than happy to fail and learn. It almost excites me. So if I muck up a run by going too low weight, too low calorie, I'm not going to be too disappointed. I'm going to be like, excellent. I've learned exactly where that line is. And so, yeah, these next few years to me are more so about trying new things that may or may not work.
Yeah, I think we share that in common. It's an experiment. I definitely don't mind failing. And when I listen to people who had breakthrough performances, the common denominator thing that I hear is they made a decision and they took a risk they don't normally take. They latched onto a pace they didn't think they could hold. They followed someone else's lead just in the moment, and then they just surprised themselves. And they did. They were like 95% chance I'm going to blow up. There's no way I can sustain this. And then they do. They actually hold it. But you could race conservative your whole life. Sometimes you got to go for it, but you got to be not afraid to fail. And so I personally don't care. So, I'm like, let's go for it.
No, I'm looking forward to this next little while leading into Boston because I love. I think I've told you this in the Discord, at least to some extent, that it's really great when people come into blocks or training in general a little bit open-minded, because a lot of people come into training with coaches very conditioned, and that's fine. I mean, we all have our conditions around thinking things are one way and they can't be any other way. And what I mean by conditioned is some people might come to a coach having already convinced themselves that very high mileage is the only way. Now, I'm sure you've listened to at least some of my podcasts and likely some other podcasts that are not mine that have proven that that doesn't always work like that. It usually does, but it doesn't always. And I really enjoy finding almost those anomalies and those different types of people, of which I know quite a few personally, luckily, that run incredibly fast times doing things that are very different to the norm. And so I'm appreciative of you to some extent here because you're willing to try things and not go into training blocks with these conditioned ideas, thinking there's only one way. Because there's not only one way, there's often quite a few ways to do things. So yeah, it's going to be fun. I'm looking forward to seeing how Boston goes in the build up and also the race for you.
I'm looking forward to it as well. Now, I've got two more topics. One I want to talk about is running age. The other one is supplements. So for running age, this thing, it fascinates me because I started running at 40. A lot of people who watch my channel or other midlife runners started running later in life. So like my running age in March, I will turn 5 years old. So it baffles me. I keep PRing my first jot around my neighborhood when I wanted to see how far I could run, which was like 11 miles. Then I finished it out because I knew 13.1 was a thing, was a 1:48:22. 5 years later, I just ran the Austin International Half to a 1:20:35. It's surprising because I keep getting older, but I still keep getting faster. And so I heard no matter when you start running, you're going to improve for roughly about 10 years. After that, it's off to, altitude or butt injections or what, however that works. But for me, I just my mind I can't wrap my mind around it because I'm not supposed to be getting faster because I'm getting older. So I guess running age is one of those things that really does matter. So my question is, out of curiosity, you've worked with a lot of runners, a lot of masters runners. Like, what is the ceiling? Does it vary? Like, how fast do you think that I can get?
Mm. Let me tell you that there is really no correct answer to this, and there's no way of really knowing, but I can estimate, and I will. Because I've seen examples of people that, I mean, I interviewed a guy called Patrick Martin. I think it was in 2023, I think. It's on the podcast. You could probably Google it to find it. And he randomly started running based on a challenge, I think, to run a 10K at the age of 38. And he ran, I think it was 42 or something, which is impressive to run straight off the bat. But then over the next 4 years, he got down to running 224 marathon at the age of 42. And his story has blown people away because it's sort of very rare for someone to start running at 38 and get to 224 that quickly. And I was convinced before interviewing him that he must have had a lot of running in his high school years. Turns out he did not. So that's just an example because I'm not answering your question yet, but I'm just sharing that there's some people out there that are just sort of freaks in a way. That's a harsh word. And I mean that in a positive sense. I mean that they're just very uniquely talented. Sorry, at least in Australia, freaks can mean positive. Um, and I think there's also examples of people that did a whole lot of volume when they were young. For example, it might not have even been running; it might have been while they were playing football, and their body has had so many problems when they're young. So this is the other end of the spectrum that when they come to running at an older age, they just can't get through even a month or two without hurting themselves. I see that as well. And so there's really big spectrum here to work with. Speaking to about your situation, it's hard to say because 5 years in, having improved almost 30 minutes at this point in the half marathon is obviously awesome. Um, I truly think that you can take off at least 5 more minutes from that half marathon time, at least. It's very difficult for me to pinpoint exactly where you will get to, but I hope to think it would be somewhere in the vicinity of 112 to 113. I don't think that's impossible, let me put it that way. And if you can run 112 and 113, you should be able to break 235 in the marathon if you train well. Now, that might sound like a stretch. It might not. I don't know. But there's also something that people say and some people roll their eyes at. But believing is really important because I said in a podcast in 2021, in 2019, that I think my ceiling is 225. And then when I ran 227 in 2019, I immediately, crossing that finish line, thought, I think I can run 220. And I think just that thought alone was really important in making me unlock something in my mind, thinking I can run faster than 225. And so for you, I think it's really important for you to not set, and this is really the case for anyone, it's to not set a limit in yourself around what you think you can do. I think it's important to be really open-minded because there is examples of people that even in their 40s and even in their 50s that take huge leaps of time in half marathon and marathon. And it's usually when they're happy, they're relaxed, they're not too stressed, and they're in an environment where their coach and the people around them don't have too many limits in mind. So yeah, I think that that's not impossible for you, but I'm keen to hear now what you think, even though I literally just said don't limit yourself, but what do you think your potential is in the future?
Yeah, I'm one of those people that I won't categorize myself as like new agey. I don't buy any crystals. I didn't buy The Secret, the book, where it's like you believe it, it will come to fruition and all that stuff. But I am a massive power of belief person in the sense that even believing in, I feel like I'm getting sick. No, I'll be fine. I'll go to sleep, I'll whatever else. Like placebo effect works for me. So when I remember reaching out to you and saying, "Hey, one day I want to break 240 for the marathon," because I was going for a sub 3. And then we quickly got into like the equivalent of like a sub 250 shape and I was like 230. Like my brain immediately goes to like, "Hey, it's possible." And what really has complemented this, I think, is running by effort because I'm not tied to a number. The number is basically a feedback loop for an expectation of what I think I can hold or not hold, or what I should be at and where I what and it's like, hey, if I just run, I'll be surprised. There's all these stories of people who run by effort and they cross the finish line and they're surprised. They set a time they never even thought was even possible or even fathomable, and that's kind of where I'm at.
You're exactly right. The first lesson I ever learned about running to effort was in my own 800-meter training. Some people may have heard this, and I'll keep it brief, but I was 19 at the time, maybe just turning 20, so almost 18 years ago now. And I was trying to win the state championships in the 800 meters in my country. Australia has 8 states, and I kept failing to break the world junior qualifying time. So I must have been 19 because it was qualifying for the world juniors, and I couldn't break the time in races that I was trying to break the time, which was 150. I kept running 151, 152. And then I entered the state championships, the open state championships, of which there was a few people slightly faster than me. I think it was two at the time. And my coach said, in this race, time is irrelevant. We're trying to win. And it's funny because my coach really didn't like one of the other athletes that was faster than me. He was about 27, quite a bit older than me at the time. He didn't like him for a reason I can't remember. And he really wanted me to beat him. And so I did beat him, but that's not the point. The point was that the time was 149.2. And I'll never forget crossing the line and seeing I was obviously happy I won, but I looked at the clock and I almost couldn't believe it for about 10 seconds. I was like, that wasn't even hard. Like it didn't feel hard. And I think it didn't feel hard because I was running on adrenaline trying to win the race. And when I crossed the line, I saw 149.2. I'm going to be honest with you. For about 3 seconds, I thought maybe the clock's wrong. And then I was like, the clock's not wrong. I just ran 149 and I didn't even try to run 149. I just tried to win. And that was the very first time I thought to myself, the mind is incredibly powerful here when it comes to running and pacing and just effort. And like you said, in fact, I have a good question for you I've been willing to ask. But before that, you said a lot of people run races and they can't believe it at the finish line that they've run so fast when they weren't looking at the time. Now, when you ran 120, because I watched your video and I was laughing at all these splits you were calling out when you were actually running much faster than you thought. When you got to the finish line and you saw 120, were you shocked, surprised? Like, what did you think? Because I don't think you looked at the clock before you saw that time, right?
I had an idea that I must be doing pretty good because my wife texts me and it goes to my watch. And she usually does sarcastic things like run faster, like, whatever.
Because she knows you're going to hear it.
Like, because she's watching me as I go along, and she texted me and she was like, "Come on, baby." Like, she usually only does that if like I'm on the cusp of a number,
Yeah.
like I might come under something. So like, oh, I must be doing good or I'm actually close to something. But I didn't know what I would be close to. I felt like that's probably what shape I was in, but I honestly had no idea that. I mean, I went, and to be fair, also when I passed the 5K mark, the 10K mark, they have the timers and I have a general idea, but I don't work in Ks, I work in miles. So I don't really know, but I do remember passing the 15K marker and it said 59 something. And I thought 2 years ago I ran that and it said 59 something. It's to the brain, right? Like I just saw something. I didn't let it get into my head, but that just said that like I think that's like a 123 pace. If I went by the 15K marker and I was like, uh-oh, I could have given up. I could have gotten defeated. I could have been like, oh wow, I'm really behind. Whatever, right? And it's just like really great to not have to worry about any of those things one way or another, like to get defeated or sort of encouraged, it's just
Mm.
like I'm running. My goal is to end up on the finish line maxed out. Yeah, and so I did want to ask you also, so your running age is
Mm.
what, 18, 20? How long have you been running?
It's about 18.
Happy 18th birthday.
Thank
So,
you.
uh, I'd be curious to like, so for me, you asked earlier, what do I think the ceiling is? I would say it's still 10, 15 minutes faster in the marathon, at least because I've never run a 90-mile week, and I
Mm.
can look at mileage as this lever that I'm gonna pull. I think that's why I'm hesitant to go run more mileage because I'm like, no, no, that's a lever I'm gonna pull when I need to, like, and I'm gonna do the unlock, and I'm gonna start that later this year. But for you, your running age is 18. You've pulled, maybe you have, maybe you haven't, the mileage lever. And so what is your ceiling? How much can you unearth, and what are some levers that you can pull with the running age of 18?
My answer is going to be pretty different to what most people would think, and it's an answer that people should not necessarily take and apply to themselves at all. In my eyes, I'm quite a different beast to most people that I coach and even most people that I know. In that I think personally, my aerobic capacity is fairly limited to some extent at where I'm currently at. I actually think my body weight and playing around with that is going to be the biggest lever. I'm quite interested in experimenting with going much, much lighter than I am now in the vicinity of 140, but I don't know if it's going to work. And I actually am not super sure how to get there right now because I want to I almost think that the safest way would be to actually take 6 to 8 weeks off running or just run very lightly in that time and then aim to get down to that because in 2021, again, I have shared this story before. I ran 220 for a marathon, and I argue I was actually probably in 218 shape. I just cramped up badly at the end, and I ran most of the race alone. And what I mean by shape is, I mean, if I didn't experience those cramps, I feel better, et cetera, et cetera. I think 218 was possibly there. I did that off about 65 miles a week leading into the race and in the 10 weeks leading in, but I was very light. And it was then, so I was about 8 to 9 pounds lighter than I normally am racing. Now I've done that again and gone another 2, 3 pounds lighter than 2021, and I've run 218. And yeah, I did this whole big mileage block before this last race, and most people that are at least interested in what I'm doing would probably go, he did high mileage. That's what made him run 218. I say no. The high mileage may have helped a little bit for sure, but I think the body weight did the bigger thing. And I say that because of the 2021 experience running 220. In my eyes, I actually think that if I keep my fitness exactly the same and I successfully, what I mean by successfully is with no risk of losing power, losing strength, training poorly due to lack of calories. If I can reduce my weight from where it is now, being like 152 down to 142, I have a feeling I'm just going to cut off 5, 6 minutes in the marathon. I'd love to prove myself wrong with that though, because I don't know if I'm right because I haven't done it. And so in the next couple of years, I think I'm going to try and see how that looks. So, but if it works out perfectly and it does what I think it could do, I think 212, 213 is not impossible. But I do think it's impossible for me to run 212 at my current body weight. I think at my current body weight, my limit is about 215. It's very difficult for me to pinpoint exactly where you will get to, but I hope to think it would be somewhere in the vicinity of 112 to 113. I don't think that's impossible, let me put it that way.
And how does the missus feel about 140, 142?
Luckily, she's a runner too. If she wasn't, then there might be some problems because that is very light. And I feel like if I got down to that weight and nailed a race, I'd probably immediately go to the closest place to get a couple of pizzas and start loading back up. So, but Reem's actually pretty keen to experiment a little bit herself with this. So luckily, running wife is helpful there. But I think, a lot of people wouldn't be in the same position with that, and they'd probably be dealing with some unimpressed partners that are just like, hang on a minute, at what point are you going to get lighter than me? So, yeah, this is going to be a short-term thing. I don't want to be that light. And I think if, like I just said, repeating myself, I think if I experiment and nail it, it's almost like I think I'll be like, okay, let's get back to being 160 again.
I think when I got into running, I was doing CrossFit, and my wife had got me into it. She did CrossFit. And when I got into running, she's like, "Oh, that's cool." It's a very supportive relationship. She was like, "Just, don't turn into those little runner guys." And I was like, "Never, never. I'll never be one of those skinny guys." And now I'm like, could I get to 140? How much faster could I get? I'm in the same place as you. So,
Yeah.
uh, all right. So lastly, just end this thing with the supplement train that's been trending. I've been taking Ketone IQ for about a year. Recently got back on the creatine. It's been floating around and trending, and
Mm.
in my inbox comes Korea gummies. I should have had it right now. It would be like, oh, check these Korea gummies out. So they're fantastic. So I'm really, like I said, I'm a placebo guy. I'm willing to try a lot of stuff. Next week it'll probably be Viagra. There's something, right? But like, do these supplements really help? And then I guess maybe more of a question is like, who really doesn't need them if they do help? Like, do newer runners need to mess with them, or should they just worry about the training?
I think creatine, so let's separate them out. Protein, there's no getting around the fact that we need protein. I think some people preach, so the three supplements that you're sort of adhering to here that I've been preaching have worked well for me are ketones, creatine, and protein. And you could argue actually carbohydrates is in there as well, because that's critical for recovery. Carbohydrates and protein are different to the other two because we need them anyway, all day, every day as runners or as just humans. And I think that they are both necessary for everybody. So the two additional ones here that you don't get from a regular diet are creatine and exogenous ketones. You specifically spoke to Ketone IQ. There's other brands out there, Delta G, Ketone Aid. They're all very good. I think creatine is the one that I would recommend, from what I understand, basically everyone to take. Why? It's very cheap, very cheap. If you buy it in powder form and you mix it to juice or Powerade or protein drink, we're talking cents per dose, 5, 10 cents. Gummies, a little bit more expensive, but they're still cheap. My understanding is, I'm not an expert here. You'd be best to speak to Dave Littman. You could research him. He speaks a lot about creatine. He's actually a doctor and knows much more about this. He's a friend of mine. The understanding is recovery is improved. Cognition is also improved. I noticed that as well. I'm a little bit more sharp in the 3, 6, 8 hours after taking creatine. That's creatine monohydrate. And I think across the board, it's just really doesn't have any downsides. The only downside is you gain, some people, not everyone, you gain a little bit of water weight. But that disappears when you get off it for about 4 or 5 days. Some people say 7 days. So you can stop taking it just before a race and that the water weight goes away. Ketones, different story. A lot more expensive. People sometimes, shake their head at how expensive it is. I'm not sure why people do that because a lot of those same people will gladly go and spend $300 on a pair of shoes that probably don't make them any faster than the other pair of shoes they have. So that's an argument that I'll gladly have with someone. But I think the bang for buck creatine is the big one. It really is because it's so cheap. People have told me that they think the creatine is probably doing more than the ketones, and that could be true. I have taken both individually, and it's hard to really say because this is all just in your mind. We don't really have, well, at least I don't have, some people could. I don't have any device that's measuring my muscle recovery or anything like that. It's really just what the brain is telling you, the feedback. So I think these things are worth taking. But I think if you're on a budget, I think adding creatine is a no-brainer. If you do have the means, I would experiment with ketones. But I think ketones are also somewhat individual in that some people seem to get a real benefit from them and others claim to not really see anything from them. The real thing is here is that each of those things in and of themselves might help your recovery by 0 point something percent. But if you add them together, I get the feeling that it's not necessarily, and this is something I've made up. I have no real science behind this, but I get the feeling that it's not necessarily 1 + 1 + 1 = 3 in these cases. It's often 1 + 1 + 1 = 5. So what I mean by that is the combination of them almost feels like it's more powerful than each and every one of themselves. Now, once again, I want to reiterate, that's just what I think. I've no backing to that.
I'm planning on calling this Coach's Corner Boston, but possibly IHO in his opinion. So best of luck in Osaka. When do you head out? When is that race? How are you feeling for that?
Yeah, 2 weeks from yesterday. So looking forward to it. I think a PB PR is on the cards again. I did laugh at one of your comments about CAM when you were like, well done, but I'm kind of glad you didn't PR because if you go 3 in a row, people start hating you. So I've done 2 that haven't been PRs now. So maybe the fifth one can be a PR. Do people hate you if you get
Love
3 and
it, love
5?
it. How many people were rooting for the Chiefs? Come on, you root against the Chiefs because you're like, they can't win three. We don't want them to win three.
Yeah.
Nobody likes it, the dynasty, right? Like the Spurs, they were really nice. They win a bunch of championships. People are like, no, they won enough. They need to stop winning. We don't like people when they win too much. You got to fail a little bit. It's more relatable when you stumble. So it's like, okay, I didn't quite hit it. Well, we'll get the next one. Like how many attempts did you record at Sweat Elite before you broke 220?
How many times did I try and fail?
Yeah, how many times did you try and fail that you recorded so that people were on that snowball was just building and building and building. So by the time that you finally broke it, you had Peter Bromka on the sidelines cheering you on to break it at Chicago.
I think I did 5 YouTube build-up series where I failed between running 220 and 219. So I think it was at a point, it was at such a sad point that I think in Chicago, a lot of people were like, here we go again, another
Yeah.
cramped up 223. I think I surprised a few people there.
Yeah, no, that's I think, and I think also like I'm right there with the sub three thing. I mean, I'm in much better shape than sub three, but I think Kofuzi took a while to get there too. I think he had like 5 attempts. He was kind of like right on the border or the cusp of it because you definitely don't want to go Casey Neistat. You take 20 years to get the sub three, you lose people. They're just
Yeah,
like,
yeah,
okay, okay.
yeah,
So and then 20 years later, you break sub three, and they're like, test him.
yeah, yeah, exactly.
All
Yeah.
right, cool. Well, I appreciate you talking, and we'll talk soon.
Always good to chat.